Hello. So, as you can see, I'm in bed. It's the early hours of the morning. But I want to talk about a subject that I have touched on before. And I guess I want to elaborate a particular angle with this. The subject I'm going to be speaking about is feminism. But more importantly, why I choose to identify myself as an egalitarian as opposed to a feminist. Now, I'm going to try and keep this video civil in terms of how I discuss the matter. So, I am a big critic of third wave Western feminism. I'll just say that outright, so my position is clear. And I'm critical for it, or of it, I should say, for a number of reasons. Um, I should say at this point, I'm not critical of the ideology of feminism because the basic ideology of feminism, i.e., equality for women, is completely fine. It's a completely noble and fine concept. Okay, so I really don't have any issue with the initial idea of feminism. And I think, had this been 1916, I would be in the camp of pushing for women's suffrage. Um, because on other issues, I support gay marriage, for instance, in terms of equality, and that's a contentious issue today. So that's the reason I say that I believe that would be my position 100 years ago. Um, yeah, I have to admit sometimes this subject gets me down, and the reason it gets me down is because it's so polarizing. I have to admit, when I get close to someone, um, when I'm developing a friendship or when I meet someone as an acquaintance or whatever, and I find out for some reason they identify themselves as a feminist, I always feel slight caution, and the reason is that I feel they will then judge me because I don't call myself a feminist. And I base this on the fact that, from experience, I find that many people who identify themselves this way tend to have a very single track mind on the subject. And for what it's worth, I really, really don't believe that women who call themselves feminists are man haters. Some are, some certainly are, but the average female feminist isn't a man hater, and the average male feminist isn't a self hating man. So, I don't believe in those stereotypes. But I do think there is a consistent and very obvious problem with some attitudes within the feminist movement. And in my opinion, there are many examples of hypocrisy, of excuse me, my Northern Irish accent can sometimes be, yeah, of bullying, of hypocrisy, of double standards, and frankly, of obnoxious behavior. And I think what a lot of feminists fail to understand is that when people speak out against feminism, in most circumstances, I'm talking in the Western context here, in most circumstances, it is not because they have some sort of ideological opposition to women's rights. It's because they see this movement coming out with the rhetoric that it does, coming out with the divisive behavior that it does, and it is incredibly off putting. It would be tempting to think that because I believe that feminism has enormous influence on large segments of the media. Um, so sometimes it would be tempting to believe that if you take issue with modern Western feminism, you're in the minority. But this could be deceptive because I've put comments on forums basically similar to what I'm saying here, and I've received, in some cases, Remember one case that got 500 likes. Now, my follow up thought process with that is actually there are a lot of people who do take issue with this, and it isn't just men. That's a very important point. It isn't just men. There are many women who actually, firstly, don't identify themselves as feminists, but also do have concerns about the way this movement has developed. I believe that third wave Western feminism causes far more problems than it does build bridges or does anything positive. Now, like I said, if I connect with someone and I find out they're a feminist, I don't suddenly hate their guts or something like that. Certainly not. But I do get wary because I think, well, if they knew my opinions on the subject, would they be tolerant? So it is a barrier because my experience of feminists is that even if they're open minded and reasonable in other areas, when it comes to this subject, it becomes tunnel vision. And it becomes a case of it's one of two things: either it gets very obnoxious and they just outright insult you, like, oh, you're a misogynist pig, or you, in the case of women, you're a self hating woman, or you're a servant of the patriarchy, and it just becomes a very sort of insulting approach. Or it becomes patronizing and it's like, oh, you don't know the meaning of feminism. I'll tell you, honey, this is the dictionary definition of feminism. But the point is, the dictionary definition doesn't, it's not as important as how a movement enacts itself. I mean, communists often say, but this is the dictionary definition of communism, and they try to distance the ideology from the tyrants associated with it. Feminists always quote the dictionary definition, but they totally underestimate the fact that people aren't bothered by the dictionary definition. They're bothered by how this movement approaches society, how it approaches problems. And the general approach is that women are downtrodden and men have all the power, and the wicked patriarchy controls women, and that's it. That is more or less summarized the outlook of modern Western feminism. And the problem with trying to reason with someone who, as a starting point, has a victimhood mentality is that no matter what you say, they will always assume a position of victimhood. So if you're a man and you try to debate in a civil way with a feminist, if it's a woman, she will automatically get into a defensive posture and say, oh, you're picking on me because I'm a woman. You don't like a woman expressing her opinion. And it will all be about, because in my experience, feminists are incapable of seeing people as individuals. Everything is about gender. So if a man disagrees with them, it's because he's a man. And it's because I'm a woman. Therefore, I'm a victim and you're picking on me. That is what I see. And so it becomes very, very difficult to get any sort of ground. And I don't think all feminists are the same. I do think there are feminists who are a lot more reasonable and decent people. I know women who identify themselves as feminists, and honestly, I wouldn't say that they're man haters. I actually quite like their personality in some cases. I find them very decent people. But I cannot, I know Chinese people who have been aligned with the Communist Party. I detest communism, but I still think they individually are decent people. So I do think that ideology and movements can somewhat hijack people. And it's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde syndrome because often these people are decent when they're outside that feminist thought process. And by decent, I mean they're reasonable, they're civil. But as soon as they get into that little bubble, which I believe is what it is. Um, there's no reasoning. You just have to slavishly agree, otherwise you're the enemy. And how can you talk to someone when they're in that phase of mind? It becomes suffocating. It becomes incredibly difficult. So when feminists say that they're the underdogs and that patriarchy controls everything, that kind of flies in the face of the fact that whenever anyone does challenge feminism publicly, they're demonized by the media. If a male politician spoke out against feminism, he would immediately be slammed as being regressive and against women's rights. It doesn't matter if he supports women's rights, but he just advocates men's rights as well. That's irrelevant to feminists. There's so many flaws in this movement. I don't have time to cover them all within this video, but all I would simply say is firstly, if the movement is about free will for women, then it's a bit contradictory to, on one hand, say feminism liberates women and gives them the power to think for themselves, while simultaneously telling women, if you don't call yourself a feminist, you're not one of us. And it's sort of become the mean girls club. Like in high school, get the popular girls and they pick on the girl that stands out. That's how modern feminism has become. It's actually quite a nasty movement. And again, that's not to say individuals are, but as a movement, yeah, I believe it is extremely intolerant. And it's also incredibly stubborn insofar as there is not an acceptance of plurality of views. So, for instance, take David Cameron. Um, there was a campaign going on a while back, and a feminist group pressured him 5 times, I believe it was, to wear one of their t shirts saying, I am a feminist. Now, imagine if a lobby group demanded that a politician wear a t shirt saying, I am a socialist, or I am a conservative for that matter, or I'm a libertarian, or anything else. How the hell is that any different? It's not. I'm pleased to say Cameron didn't budge. Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg, they did take up the offer to wear the t-shirt. I don't know if that's because they really do see themselves as feminists, or if it was just a populist thing. Because actually, feminism in its own way is a populist movement. It's populist among a particular aspect of the left, and it is more associated with the left. There are right-wing conservative feminists, but let's be honest, it is a lot more associated with the left. Um, so yeah, if you identify yourself with a feminist and you're watching this video, you've stumbled across it, and you're sitting there thinking, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, what I would simply say to you is, you're never going to convince me, or many, many other people like me, by simply saying, you don't understand feminism. Because when people observe a movement, they can judge for themselves. There's even a classic line that, oh, you're a feminist, but you just don't realize it. People have the absolute liberty to describe themselves whatever way they want. So I will defend the right of feminists to call themselves feminist. But I insist that they have no right to pressure anyone else to label themselves that way. And, if you have a female celebrity and she says that she doesn't identify with feminism, I guarantee you feminist lobby groups would be onto her and they would say, oh, you don't understand it, or you're a silly. I'm not even going to use the sort of language they would use because that's what it is. It's a mean girls club. And this is a movement that, whenever it is criticized, there's basically two approaches: either vilify the opponent instead of engaging in civil debate, or ridicule, which can amount to a form of bullying. When feminists post photos saying that they're laughing at male tears whilst men are discussing issues like male suicide, that to me demonstrates that there is a deep callousness within this movement. Now, that's not to say all feminists are callous. I know feminists, for instance, who do care about issues like male suicide, and they actually are genuinely egalitarian. But what I would say to moderate feminists is, with the greatest respect, don't complain that the movement has a bad image if you're not prepared to speak out against the extremists in your midst. Okay, you may personally be a reasonable person. You may personally be genuinely egalitarian in your thinking. And you may acknowledge that there are issues impacting men as well. But the movement, the way it comes across these days, is deeply, deeply intolerant. That's that's it. Okay, and this isn't just thinking of the men's rights movement. There are many, many people who wouldn't identify themselves as masculist. I mean, for the record, I don't. I don't call myself a masculist. The reason I don't is not because I don't believe in men's rights, but because I think that runs a risk of ending up the way third wave feminism currently is. And there are, frankly, certain men's rights activists who don't do the movement a great deal of good with some of the rhetoric. Um, and that's probably for another video. But to summarize, I'm very, very wary of any movement that has division at its core. And feminism does. Okay, people can insist that it's all about equality, but in the end of the day, if you're part of a movement that is saying that one half of the population represents privilege and the other half is downtrodden, that is a divisive attitude. Okay, it's no different than one racial group saying we hate the other racial group because they have all the power. You know, it's I'm very wary of any sort of politics like that. Very wary. So that's why I call myself an egalitarian. Egalitarian is neutral. It doesn't. It's not biased towards men. It's not biased towards women. How can anyone rationally have a problem with egalitarianism? So I have no problem with people calling themselves feminists, but I do have a problem when they try to enforce their views onto others, which happens very often. And I just think it's a very sad situation that there isn't really a lot of free expression on this in public forums because you have large segments of powerful media organizations like the BBC that have journalists who are basically feminists, and therefore that blinds them to responsible journalism. You can see when there are feminist journalists interviewing people who are critical of the movement, they let their emotions overtake their journalism. And this happens quite often. Um, and if you could be damn sure if the BBC runs an article on the subject of feminism, let's say it's about critics of feminism, what they will do, and this is classic BBC behavior, they will give maybe 20% of the segment to the critics, they'll give the other 80% to feminists and to a pro feminist angle. They had a report a few years ago on the issue of male suicide in Britain and issues impacting men. And being the BBC, they managed to turn the whole thing into an argument for feminism. And I just think that's very unfortunate. So the reason the men's rights movement has become vocal isn't because these guys are cavemen who want to keep women down. It's because they're sick and tired of being laughed at, of being pushed into a corner, and told that their views don't count because they are the privileged ones. You treat people like that, they're going to react in a very negative way. So I'll round this up, but it's as simple as that. And I will never, ever, ever allow anyone to pressure me into identifying myself in any way. And I will not tolerate anyone talking down to me. I don't know everything. I don't claim to know everything. But when I associate with ideology or movements, I think about it very, very carefully. And fundamentally, I am very, very wary of any movement that is symbolized by divisiveness. And I do believe that feminism today has very, very little positive to offer in its Western context. I'm not talking about women's rights movements in countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are very serious issues going on. And that is not to say that things are perfect for women in the West, but it certainly isn't the situation that feminists make it out to be. You know, if you listen to the feminist worldview, it's basically men have all the power, women have no power. Um, and that's the narrative. And to me, that's dangerous. So all it does is divide people. That's why I'm extremely skeptical of the likes of the Women's Equality Party. Because no matter how much they claim to be inclusive and all about equality, fundamentally, the very basis of their movement is divisive. When you are promoting a victimhood logic and you're doing it at the price of saying that the other is the problem, then yeah, that's not progressive. It just isn't. So I absolutely support the right for people to call themselves feminist, but I absolutely support the right for people to criticize feminism. And if we are not careful, this is another point, I'll just finish with this. Some people might say, oh, well, you're overthinking it. Firstly, you cannot escape a single day without some news report about feminists complaining about something, about terrible men doing this or that. You can't escape it. And the second point is that if this movement really does go on challenged, it has a certain intolerance. And this has been seen recently in Sweden. There was actually a movement by a feminist group to make it illegal to criticize the movement. Now, I don't know how far that got. I think even liberal Sweden wouldn't be quite that crazy to make it illegal to criticize an ideology and a movement. Um, but that just shows that there is a regressive side to feminism, and I'd like to know why moderate feminists don't speak out against it. You know, with the greatest respect, you cannot complain that your movement has a bad image if you're not prepared to call out the extremes within it. So instead of lecturing people as to why they don't understand feminism, take a look. Just take a look at the movement and take a look and really, really, really think about it. Think about why so many men dislike it. Maybe, just maybe, it's because many men are sick and tired of being made scapegoats for everything and being constantly shamed. That's common sense. You know, if you're telling people that their sex is to blame for everything and that they, you know, when you're constantly trying to make men feel guilty, of course they're not going to appreciate the movement that symbolizes that. And as for male feminists, again, I defend your right to call yourself that, but you've no right to tell other men they should be that way and to associate themselves with that. Anyway, I've spoken a bit longer than I intended here, but there were a lot of things to cover. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for listening.